I bring to you another CIA agent, well, ex-CIA agent exposing the whole entire organization. And this is not the first time we're talking about this, so at this point, I'm thinking maybe we make a series that says something like another one. Because, like, wow, whenever they leave the institution, they just tell us everything that we already knew or we're already speculating, but now we have evidence. You know what I mean? But anyways, fam, let me show you first this clip. His name is John Stockwell, and this is what he said about how the CIA plants fake information.
There are other functions, however, some of them more legitimate than others. One is to run secret wars. Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds. And this is a major function of the CIA. And unfortunately, of course, it overlaps into the gathering of information. You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories. You also work on their human vulnerabilities to recruit them in a classic sense, to make them your agent so that you can control what they do, so you don't have to set them up sort of, you know, by putting one over on them. So you can say, here, plant this one next Tuesday.
Can you do this with responsible reporters?
Yes, the Church Committee brought it out in 1975, and then Woodward and Bernstein put an article in Rolling Stone a couple of years later. 400 journalists cooperating with the CIA, including some of the biggest names in the business, to consciously introduce the stories into the press.
Well, give me a concrete example of how you use the press this way.
Well, for example, in my war, the Angola War that I helped to manage, 1/3 of my staff was propaganda. I had propagandists all over the world, principally in London, Kinshasa, and Zambia. We would take stories which we would write and put them in the Zambia Times, and then pull them out and send them to a journalist on our payroll in Europe. But his cover story, you see, would be that he had gotten them from his stringer in Lusaka, who had gotten them from the Zambia Times. But after that point, the journalists, Reuters and AFP, the management was not witting of it. Now, our contact man in Europe was, and we pumped just dozens of stories about Cuban atrocities, Cuban rapists. We didn't know of one single atrocity committed by the Cubans. It was pure, raw, false propaganda to create an illusion.
Yeah, pretty much the same story as what Frank Snip was telling us in the previous video that we talked about.
You briefed the press, did you not, when you were there?
Well, I had several jobs. One of my jobs was that of analyst. I also was an interrogator and indeed briefed the press when we, the CIA, wanted to circulate disinformation on a particular issue. Disinformation is not necessarily a lie. It may be a half-truth. And we would pick out a journalist. I would go do the briefing and hope that he would put the information in print. For instance, if we wanted to get across to the American public that the North Vietnamese were building up their force structure in South Vietnam, I would go to a journalist and advise him that in the past 6 months, X number of North Vietnamese forces had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail system through southern Laos. Now, there is no way a journalist can check that information. So either he goes with the information or he doesn't, and ordinarily or usually the journalist would go with it because it looked like some kind of exclusive. And I would say our percentage planning that kind of data was 70 to 80%. The correspondents we targeted were those who had terrific influence, the most respected journalists in Saigon, like Robert Chaplin of the New Yorker magazine, Kai's Beach of the Los Angeles Times from time to time, and also he worked for the Chicago Daily News. Bud Merrick of U.S. News and World Report, Malcolm Brown of the New York Times, even Maynard Parker of Newsweek magazine. We would go after these gentlemen. I would be directed to cultivate them, to spend time with them at the Caravel Hotel or the Continental Hotel, to socialize with them, and slowly but surely to try to gain their confidence by dolloping out valid information which was true. And then I would drop into a conversation the data that we wanted to get across which might not be true. One piece of data, for instance, that we managed to plant in the New Yorker magazine had to do with a supposed North Vietnamese effort in 1973 to develop airfields along the border of South Vietnam. The reason we wanted to plant this information was that we were trying to persuade the U.S. Congress that Saigon should continue to get a great deal of aid, and that the North Vietnamese were the chief violators of the ceasefire accord. That was printed in the New Yorker magazine under the byline of Robert Chaplin, as indeed was a great deal of such information which we tried to circulate. If I planted a piece of information with a reporter, I would ordinarily then try to create an environment in which he could not check the information. I would go to the British ambassador and brief him on the disinformation I had just given the reporter. So when the reporter wanted to cross-check what I'd told him with, say, the British ambassador, New Zealand ambassador, or what have you, he would get false confirmation, the same message coming back at him, and he'd say, aha, I've got proof that Frank Snepp told me the truth, when in fact what he'd gotten was simply an echo of what I'd given him in the first place via the British ambassador or other of our friendly diplomatic contacts. I am, as an ex-CIA agent, opposed to the disinformation activities in which I was involved. I admit that I was involved, and I think it served no useful purpose. Propagandizing the American public or Congress is not the CIA's job.
So the moral of the story is, don't believe everything that you are reading on the mainstream media. Make sure that you have people on the ground, or you talk to people that are from that country to really understand what is really going on in that country. Even then, you might not get the full information because people are different. People pick sides, people have different ideologies. So I want us to be really careful who we take our informations from, and also just take everything with a pinch of salt, especially when it comes to politics. For example, like Mali, if you remember, they were talking about how the Malian military was doing this and that and hurting civilians, and you remember the stories that we were covering. It turns out the Malian government came out and said, I have evidence, actually it was the French military and we had nothing to do with this. And when they started saying that, all of a sudden the stories just calmed down and we're no longer talking about the atrocities that were committed. So these are the kind of stories that we need to be careful about. And also, as I said, I strongly suggest hearing from the actual locals, the people that are living on the ground, to make sure that we don't get deceived, because I can tell you firsthand, I've been deceived so many times. And after being deceived so many times and finally learning the truth, it really humbles you and makes you question everything you hear from this mainstream medias, right? Anyways, fam, let me know down below what your thoughts are about what Stockwell said, as well as Snepp. I am Wongel Zelalem. I'll see you on the next one. Stay blessed. Bye.